In today's video, we're taking a look at some off-season rumors concerning teams like the Vancouver Canucks, the Toronto Maple Leafs, the Vegas Golden Knights, and the Pittsburgh Penguins. And that's coming up next. So welcome back to another video here at Top Shelf Hockey. Now, as I mentioned, we have several teams we're looking at today, but before we jump into the latest rumors, one quick update here as well from the Minnesota Wild. It's been reported through Michael Russo, the Athletic, that the Wild apparently are moving on from captain Mikko Koivu, who is an unrestricted free agent. There's no word yet if he's going to be seeking another contract or if he'll decide to retire. I know there's been a lot of rumblings around whether or not it was the end of his career or not, but it's been believed through sources of Russo's that Guerin has already let Koivu know that the Wild are at least moving on and are not going to be bringing back their captain for anymore. So he's obviously done in Minnesota, which makes sense. They need to get younger and faster, more skilled. It doesn't make sense to have somebody his age still with the organization. So we'll see if Koivu continues to play or not, or if he seeks a contract through free agency, or if indeed this was the end of the road for him in the NHL. Now, as I mentioned, we have pretty much 4 teams we're taking a look at here for off-season rumors, and I want to kick things off with the Vancouver Canucks. Now, we had media availability from GM Jim Benning, and he had a lot of quotes and things that he said in this availability, which kind of spurned on a lot of other, potential rumors of things that they could be looking to do. He obviously didn't, come out and exactly say what his plans were, but he made enough comments that it kind of leads you to speculate here a little bit. Now, in terms of goaltending, we've talked about this a lot and wondered if the play of Thatcher Demko could change their minds over signing Jacob Markstrom. It appears as though that is not the case. Benning made it clear that their full intention was to continue to sign Markstrom, that he's already had continued dialogue and discussions with Markstrom's agent, and that they would like to hammer out a deal. And even though Demko was really good for them in the last 3 games of the playoffs, that it's not enough for them to kind of change gears in that regard. So they'd really like to go into next year with Markstrom, and Demko's kind of how we made it sound. But ultimately, many feel that if they sign Markstrom, it's going to increase the odds that they trade Demko. Doesn't have to be right away, but as we've talked about before, because of the Seattle expansion draft implications, they're going to be at risk to lose Demko. I think if all the things you could look at for players that the Canucks can protect, by the time they get to the Seattle draft, I think goaltending will be an area that they're most inclined to lose a player to, if indeed, that they don't trade Demko ahead of time. So with that, I've seen discussions that maybe Demko could be traded during the season, but ultimately, I guess it's pretty clear that if they sign Markstrom, and he's going to be looking for some term, he's probably going to be looking for at least a form of a no-trade clause, that if that indeed does take place, Demko is, going to be waiting quite a while before he can be the number 1, which increases the odds that they would trade him anyways. And after how he played in the playoffs, his value would be very high. So obviously we'll have to see if a deal can be reached between Vancouver and Markstrom, but it looks as though Benning is still pretty intent on making that happen. Now, of course, he also touched on several other players, including guys like Chris Tanev. It sounded like there was still a lot of interest to bring Tanev back. Obviously, it's probably going to have to be in a pretty short-term deal. I'm guessing 1 or 2 years. Don't know what kind of money, but Benning did express interest in that regard. But he did say, which is not a big surprise, that the Canucks are going to have to make some hard decisions, and some of those hard decisions might even be with some of their young players. And you can't help but wonder, that's pretty obvious, I think, that he's talking about Jake Virtanen and maybe even Troy Stecher, who's still relatively young as well. Now, staying with the blue line for a second before we jump into Virtanen, obviously, many believe that based on the cap, Tanev and Stecher probably both can't return, and where he, made it known that Tanev was, very interested in bringing him back. That very well could mean Stecher's out. I mean, some view Stecher as, a bit more of a spare part. They have some younger defensemen as well, like Olli Juolevi, Rathbone, etc., that are going to be, hopefully looking for more playing time. You could even see a guy like Oscar Fantenberg. He may not come back because his contract's up too. So difficult to say, but I would think that there's a good chance that Stecher may not actually end up coming back. It's going to boil down to money, I think, but if he's looking for more money than what the Canucks are willing to spend on that position, which makes sense, that he won't be back. But in regards to Virtanen, Benning made some quotes. It kind of, many people are saying that Virtanen was kind of thrown under the bus here, that he basically said that Virtanen was a player that they were expecting a lot more of. That yes, he scored a big goal in Game 6, but ultimately overall that he didn't sound like he was overly impressed. He said that Jake has the size and the speed and the skill, and he's a player they expected more from. Now, Virtanen's a restricted free agent, needs a new deal, probably going to be somewhere around the $3 million mark. And with how things are looking, they're going to want to have another $3 million player in the bottom six. I really don't think they can afford to do that. But at the same time, there's also comments that they need to get more out of their bottom six. Well, he was really by far their most productive player down there. And if he's not in that bottom six, then the bottom six is likely going to be even less productive moving forward. So it's debatable on what the right answer or right decision is in that regard. I do understand how there could be some frustration with the team and Virtanen, but obviously if they try to sign Tyler Toffoli, which is also expected to be on the agenda here for Jim Benning, that's going to push Virtanen down to at best a third line status. And do they want him in that role? It just doesn't sound like they do. So I think Jake Virtanen is pretty likely going to be used as a trade bait or maybe a sweetener in helping them move one of their other unfavorable contracts in the bottom six, whether it be Brandon Sutter and or Louis Eriksson. As I mentioned before, those are the two contracts that really need to go to free up some money to get these other things looked after. I mean, obviously, if they do sign Tyler Toffoli, which I think is, decent chance. I think it's less likely that they sign Toffoli than Markstrom. I think Markstrom is top priority number one. Toffoli will be close to second on that regard. But if Toffoli stays, and I think it's pretty much a given, Virtanen goes, and maybe Virtanen would be added in with a Sutter or an Eriksson as a sweetener to try to have another team take those contracts on. If you've been following along our new series for the offseason plan series or the What's Next series for all the teams, we're only done a couple videos so far, but teams like Detroit and Ottawa have been covered. And obviously, a team like Ottawa has lots of cap space. They would probably take a bad contract if they're willing to throw in a good-looking younger player as well. So maybe that's a way that they can shed a contract. They don't have to pay for Tannen, but instead maybe they end up paying Markstrom and Tanev, possibly Toffoli. They have some other moves they need to make too, but certainly lots of good comments from Jim Benning to kind of give us an allusion here to what he's thinking for the offseason, for what they're going to do. They obviously made some great progress this year, but they also shown that they still have a ways to go to be a legitimate cup contender, and they have some tough decisions to make. You can see guys like Demko and Stetcher and Virtanen possibly all traded in an effort to keep guys like Markstrom, Toffoli, and Tanev. It's not a given, but it is a strong possibility. Now, another thing with the Vancouver Canucks as well that's been rumored, and I've seen numerous outlets talking about online, is the possibility of them going after a guy like Tyson Barrie. Now, obviously, if guys like Stetcher don't return and Fantenberg don't return, and there's no guarantee that Tanev returns either, even though there is interest on both sides to make it happen. I think out of the three, Tanev's the most likely, but obviously, if they could find a way, there's rumors that they're really interested in Tyson Barrie again. Now, they were really close to acquiring Tyson Barrie via trade before he was traded to the Maple Leafs last year when he was still with the Avalanche, and it was known that the Avs were looking to move him. The Canucks were involved quite heavily in trade talks with Colorado, but unfortunately the Leafs put together what they felt to be a better package, and he ended up going there instead. But ultimately there was quite a bit of interest on the Vancouver side, and there appears to be still to this day. I know things didn't work out the best for him in Toronto, but he's a better player than what he showed there, but can certainly be more productive. The Canucks, you could argue, could use another puck mover back there, and Barrie could be an interesting choice. But again, like for most players, for the right price, especially for guys that aren't coming off their best seasons or aren't coming off their most productive seasons. And a lot of it's going to depend on a lot of other moves, like we talked about here, depending on if they can move out guys like Sutter and Eriksson and free up some money. Do they sign Toffoli? Do they sign Markstrom? A lot of that will certainly play a role moving forward, but I've seen the connection. Of course, he's a BC boy as well. Pretty good puck-moving defenseman throughout his career. So it makes sense that he would be interested. I can understand why they would be interested. Obviously, like I said, the money would have to be cheap. Will Tyson Barrie be one of those players who takes a prove-it-to-me kind of contract where he signs maybe a cheaper one-year contract in an effort to kind of reprove himself, get his numbers back up with the hopes of getting a better contract the year after? Obviously, with the shutdown and the pandemic, the cap has been hit. It's going to be flat for 2 to 3 years. And then, some of these players might have to take less money than they were hoping for. But at the same time, if it allows them to continue improving themselves, they might have to do what they got to do to get their careers back on track. So let me know what your thoughts are about the possibility of Tyson Barrie being a Vancouver Canuck next season. Now, there was word from Pierre LeBrun of The Athletic that perhaps Wayne Simmonds could become a Toronto Maple Leaf next season. Obviously, the longtime veteran NHL player has bounced around with a few teams, split last year between New Jersey and Buffalo, now makes his home north of Toronto, spends a lot of time in the city. LeBrun had an interview with Simmonds where that idea was kind of broached and whether or not he would consider signing with the Leafs. It was pretty out there, and ultimately Simmonds made it known that he would certainly be open to the idea. I mean, it's certainly an interesting thing to think about. You know, the Leafs are going to be going through some more changes, obviously, and you know, Simmonds could be a guy that fits in well if he's willing to take a cheap enough contract. Because the only problem is I can see there being some interest. He can add a different element that they don't have. He could do a similar type of thing that Jason Spezza did, but it's going to have to be willing to take a pretty cheap contract. Now, will there be opportunities for Wayne Simmonds to get more money elsewhere? That's debatable. I mean, obviously, he's come off back-to-back seasons where his numbers are certainly down. You could tell, you know, age is catching up to him a little bit. He can still be a valuable piece for the right price and the right role. And I do think that it could be a possible, you know, match there. But at the same time, like I said, the Leafs have a lot of forwards under contract. There's bound to be some other guys that maybe don't return. Does Jason Spezza return? It's another question. Does a guy like Freddie Gauthier return? They certainly have more questions than answers, and you don't know what Kyle Dubas is going to do, but it was certainly an interesting thought for sure, especially if a guy like Colin Clifford, who they brought in from the Kings, I mean, there's up for debate of whether or not he comes back next year. He can certainly play a similar role to Simmonds, who can be that physical guy, protect his teammates, be an energy type of player, go to the front of the net and not be, afraid to take one for the team there, because obviously having a net front presence can be challenging. Not any player can do that. And Simmonds throughout his career has. So maybe he would be a good fit there. But like I said, a lot of it boils down to money. He acknowledged the fact that he knows that the Leafs are going to be tight for cap space, but many other teams will as well. And he's certainly going to have to weigh his options when free agency officially opens, which looks like it's likely going to be on October the 9th. So let me know your thoughts, especially if you're a Toronto fan. Do you see a fit between the Leafs and Wayne Simmonds? If so, what would you be willing to pay if he did indeed sign with the Leafs as a free agent when the offseason hits here in October? Now, I also want to revisit the goaltending situation in Vegas. It's been heavily discussed. We've talked about it here a few times. Of course, we saw the tweet from Alan Walsh on Twitter, who represents Marc-Andre Fleury with the big sword from Peter DeBoer going through his back. Obviously, Fleury feels like the team's kind of turned their back on him after they brought in Robin Lehner at the trade deadline. It wasn't really supposed to be a situation where Lehner has been granted the starting role. He was supposed to be the insurance policy, basically, and Fleury was still going to be the guy. That hasn't really happened. Peter DeBoer is currently really favored Lehner the entire return to play, the entire playoffs, and really you can't make much of an argument against that. He's been phenomenal through the playoffs. He's got 4 shutouts. He's done extremely well. So you can't say that Lehner is being favored because Fleury's been better and is not getting the chance. That's really not it. Fleury's been pretty decent too when he's had a chance to play, but you can't really, I don't think at least, have a strong argument that Lehner shouldn't be the guy because he's earning it night after night after night. But Jesse Granger of The Athletic is reporting that his sources close to the team that they already are starting negotiations on a long-term deal with Robin Lehner, that they're looking to sign him. He reported he's estimating around a 5-year deal, somewhere it's around 5, maybe more, so between $5 and $6 million per year. Now, wouldn't be shocking if Lehner's camp kind of drags this on at least till the end of the playoffs, so we can see how far he ends up helping take them. Because if he ends up winning a Stanley Cup, then that's just going to push his price tag up, obviously. So he's going to use that for his own negotiating sake to get the most that he can. So obviously, Robin Lehner, I'd be shocked if he signs a contract before the playoffs are over. But the fact that they've started talking isn't a huge surprise. It's been somewhat speculated for quite a while now that Lehner is a player that Vegas was very, very interested in keeping. But there's just no way from a cap standpoint that they can sign him and keep Fleury. They can't do what Montreal did. Montreal has Price at $10.5 million. They traded for Jake Allen, who makes over $4 million. They got almost $15 million tied up in their goaltending. Well, Vegas can't do that. Montreal's got tons of space. Vegas does not. They'd have to trade away a lot of other good pieces that I'm sure they really do not want to do. So obviously, if this happens, what is going to happen with Fleury. And I can't help but revisit a scenario that we talked about sometime, I can't remember what day it was, but sometime in the last week, where we reviewed an article from the Pittsburgh side of things with Marc from TribLive.com, exploring the possibility of Fleury returning to his home in Pittsburgh, where he started his career and played so well for so long. Now, the argument there was that Marc-Andre Fleury has a form of a no-trade clause, so he can block certain teams from being traded to, which is going to make things complicated. Obviously, his age is going to complicate things, and he's got 2 years left at $7 million, and there's not many teams around the NHL who could really absorb a $7 million goaltender contract. So could Vegas trade him with retaining a little bit? That's a possibility. That's certainly a strong possibility if they can find that trade, but that trade is going to be challenging, and the article here kind of references the fact that it might be impossible, and it's the only way they can keep Leonard is moving on from Fleury. They may not have any choice but to do a buyout. If they do a buyout, and I'll show you the buyout calculator here on the screen from capfriendly.com, so you can see they would save a fair bit of money over the next 2 years, but then they would have 2 years added on, because essentially he's owed 2/3 of the money, which would be a little over $8 million over the 2 years, but it's paid out over twice the time frame that the contract originally had left on it. So he'd be on Vegas's books for 4 years instead of 2, but obviously it'd be less money for the next 2, and then some dead cap space for 2 years after that. And ultimately that would make him an unrestricted free agent. So it wouldn't be the same as them retaining, but if they can't make a trade, now maybe a team surprises us and the trades for Fleury with a little bit of salary retention, I don't know. But I do agree with the sentiment of the article that it's not going to be easy. There's not going to be a lot of teams willing to take Fleury on at $7 million. I'm not sure there'd be a lot of teams willing to take Fleury at $5 or $6 million with some salary retained. I mean, maybe they could. I don't know. But ultimately, Vegas is going to have to get creative here. And at the end of the day, with Pittsburgh, they're looking to trade Matt Murray. That's pretty clear. Tristan Jarry's probably not going to get an expensive contract. If they could sign Fleury as a free agent, who's already going to be making money from Vegas, he probably would be willing to accept a pretty cheap contract. Maybe they could go with a 1A, 1B situation in Pittsburgh next year and go with Fleury and Jarry rather than Jarry and DeSmith. I mean, it's certainly something fun to talk about, as I talked about before when I mentioned it. As like I said, it was pretty unlikely, and I do think it is still, but it's a fun thought, and I don't see Pittsburgh pulling off a trade for Fleury. That would be, I mean, I guess crazier things have happened, but ultimately, I think that would be very, very difficult to pull off because of the cap. Could they sign him as a free agent to a cheap contract if he were bought out? Sure, that's the only way that could happen. But would Vegas want to do a buyout? Preferably not, because then they're tied to him for 4 years instead of 2. But it's certainly a fun possibility. But regardless of where Fleury goes, it's becoming more and more apparent that his time with Vegas will be done this season. Leonard is going to get the long-term deal with Vegas. He will be their goalie of the future moving forward for the next number of years. And Fleury is going to be starting off somewheres next year in a New Jersey. So let me know what you think down below. Do you think Vegas can find a trade for Fleury? And if not, is this buyout scenario something that's even plausible that you could see happening? And if it does it make sense for him to go back to where he started and kind of ride things out for the last year or two here to finish things up with the Penguins? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments and we'll discuss further. If you're new to the channel, consider subscribing and turning on your notifications so you don't miss any future content, and give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. I'd appreciate it if you did. As always, thank you for watching, and I'll catch you next time.